The blood was copper-colored and it was everywhere. Dan Harlow had been following a game trail back toward the outpost when he first saw it. Thick streaks of it painted across the ferns and dripping from broken branches. Whatever was bleeding had been dragging itself through the jungle for a long time. That he should have turned around. He knew that. The smart thing was to keep walking, reach the outpost, report the crash, and wait for a pickup shuttle. His own ship was 2 kilometers behind him, half buried in a hillside after clipping a ridge during the storm. He had a busted radio, a field medkit, and maybe 3 days of rations. He had no business following a blood trail on a jungle moon full of things that could eat him. But Dan had been a field medic in the colonial wars. He had spent 4 years dragging wounded soldiers out of mud and rubble while the sky burned above him. Something in his brain had been rewired during those years. When he saw blood, he followed it. He did not think about it. His legs just moved. The trail led him into a clearing where the trees had been smashed flat. Something large had fallen here, hard. The undergrowth was crushed into the mud, and the air smelled like hot metal and rust. That was where he found a creature. It was the size of a heavy transport truck. 6 limbs, each one thick as a tree trunk, ending in claws that could tear through hull plating. Its body was covered in layered scales that shifted between dark green and black, depending on the light. A wide jaw filled with teeth longer than his forearm hung open, breathing in shallow, wet gasps. 2 massive wings lay crumpled against its sides like broken sails. Dan had read about draiths in the Union Wildlife Files. Class: 9 Apex Predator. Contact forbidden. Extermination authorized on site near settlements. They were supposed to be the most dangerous land creatures in this sector. Entire military squads had been wiped out by single adults. This one was young, maybe adolescent, and it was dying. A poacher's harpoon was buried deep in its left flank. The barbed head lodged somewhere between the ribs. A second wound ran along the side of its neck. A crude cut that looked like someone had tried to dig out the venom glands with a blade and then given up. The cuts were ugly and infected. Yellow fluid oozed from the edges. The creature's breathing was getting slower. Its massive amber eyes were half closed. One of its hind legs twitched weakly in the mud. Dan stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. He could hear the jungle around him. Insects buzzing, birds calling, water dripping from the canopy. Normal sounds, safe sounds. All he had to do was walk away, and those sounds would carry him right back to the outpost. Nobody would blame him. Nobody would even know. The draith let out a sound that it was low. So low that Dan felt it in his ribs before he heard it with his ears. A broken, shaking vibration that climbed through the mud and up through the soles of his boots and settled somewhere behind his heart. It was not a roar. It was not a growl. That was a whimper. Dan had heard that sound before. In field hospitals on colony worlds. From soldiers lying in the dark with holes in their bodies. Too weak to scream. Too scared to be silent. The sound a living thing makes when it knows it is dying and it does not want to die alone. He knelt beside the creature and opened his medkit. The neck wound was the easier one. He cleaned it as best he could with antiseptic gel that was designed for human tissue and probably would not work on alien biology. But infection was infection. Dead flesh was dead flesh. He packed the wound with emergency sealant and wrapped it with gauze from his kit. The draith flinched when he touched it, but did not snap at him. Its amber eye rolled toward him and watched every movement of his hands. The harpoon was the real problem. The barbed head was buried deep. If he pulled it out wrong, he would tear the artery and the creature would bleed out in minutes. He needed surgical tools. He had a medkit designed for human soldiers. He sat back on his heels and looked at the dying creature. It looked back at him. Dan took a breath. Then he stood up and started walking back toward his crashed shuttle. Not toward the outpost, toward the wreck. He needed metal he could heat. He needed wire. He needed something flat and thin enough to work as a probe. He needed cargo straps for tourniquets. It took him 2 hours to gather what he needed and hike back. The whole time, he was terrified that he would return to the clearing and find the creature dead. But when he pushed through the last wall of ferns, the draith was still there. Still breathing, still watching the gap in the trees where Dan had disappeared. When it saw him, It made that low sound again. But this time it was different. Softer. Almost like relief. Dan set down his supplies and got to work that he did not sleep that night. He heated a strip of shuttle hull over a fire until it glowed, used it to cauterize the worst of the neck wound, and then spent 3 hours slowly working the harpoon free while the creature screamed beneath him. The sound shook the trees. Birds exploded from the canopy. Things in the jungle went silent. Dan held the wound closed with both hands, blood running between his fingers, and talked to the creature in a calm, steady voice. He told it about Earth, about rain, about dogs, about his mother's garden. He talked because silence felt like giving up. By midnight, the bleeding had slowed. Dan built a shelter over the creature's body, using shuttle panels to keep the rain off. He shared his water. He sat in the mud beside a monster and waited for morning, but he did not leave. Something was watching him from the trees. Dan noticed it on the second night. He was sitting beside the young draith, replacing the sealant on the neck wound, when a branch cracked somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. Then another. Then a low vibration rolled through the ground beneath him, so deep it made his teeth ache. He looked up slowly, eyes, amber and gold, reflecting the fire. Not one pair, 5 pairs, each set wider apart than his shoulders, sitting high above the ground, which meant the heads they belonged to were enormous. The pack had found them, but Dan's hands went still on the wound. His heart hammered against his ribs. 5 adult draiths, each one bigger than the juvenile he had been treating, each one fully capable of biting him in half without effort. They stood in the tree lean like living shadows, scales shifting in the firelight, and they watched him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. He thought about running. The thought lasted about 2 seconds. He could not outrun a creature with 6 legs. He could not hide from something that hunted by vibration and scent. And even if he could, the juvenile would die without him. The harpoon wound was closed, but still fragile. The infection in the neck was fighting the sealant. If he left now, everything he had done would mean nothing to Dan did the only thing that made sense to him. He kept working. He cleaned the wound. He replaced the bandage. He talked to the juvenile in that same calm voice he had used all night. He did not look at the adults. He did not make sudden movements. He simply acted like a medic treating a patient, because that was what he was. The largest of the adults moved first. It stepped out of the tree lean and into the clearing, and the ground shook slightly under its weight. Deep scars ran across its face and down its neck. One of its eyes was milky and blind. This was the alpha. Dan could feel it in the way the other 4 went still when it moved. The alpha crossed the clearing in 4 slow strides and stopped 2 meters from Dan. Its head lowered. A blast of warm, wet breath hit Dan's face, smelling of meat and copper. The massive nostrils flared as it sniffed him. Then it moved its head over the juvenile and sniffed the wounds, the bandages, the sealant. Dan sat perfectly still. His hands were covered in the juvenile's blood. He kept them open and visible. The alpha looked at him. One good eye, amber and deep, with a vertical pupil that contracted in the firelight. Dan had the sudden, disorienting feeling that he was being evaluated. Not as prey, not as a threat, as a person. The alpha turned away, walked to the far edge of the clearing, and settled onto the ground. It tucked its limbs beneath its body and rested its scarred head on its front claws, facing Dan. Watching IT did not attack. It did not leave. The other 4 adults entered the clearing one by one after that. They spread out around the edges, forming a rough circle with Dan and the juvenile at the center. They were guarding them. Dan let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his knees and breathed until they stopped. The next 30 hours blurred together. Dan worked on the juvenile in shifts, sleeping in 20-minute bursts against the creature's warm flank. The juvenile's breathing steadied. The infection began to retreat. On the morning of the second day, it lifted its head for the first time and looked around the clearing with clear eyes. When it saw Dan, it pressed its snout against his chest so hard it nearly knocked him over. Dan laughed. It was a tired, cracking sound, but it was real. He put his hand on the creature's nose and scratched the rough scales above its nostrils. The juvenile closed its eyes and made a sound like a deep, Rumbling purred, he started calling it Runt. It was a stupid name for something the size of ground truck, but it felt right. The pack did something unexpected on that second day. The alpha disappeared into the jungle and came back dragging the leg of some animal Dan did not recognize. It dropped the meat 3 meters from Dan's shelter and walked away. Dan stared at it. Then he looked at the alpha. The alpha looked back. He cooked the meat over his fire. It tasted strange, but it was good. Protein. Calories. He had been running on emergency bars and water for 2 days. His body nearly cried with relief. The next day, the alpha dropped the food closer. 2 meters. The day after that, it placed the leg directly at Dan's feet and stood there, waiting until Dan reached down and picked it up. Only then did the alpha turn away. Dan understood. This was not charity. This was ritual. The pack fed its own. And somehow, without words, without anything Dan could point to and explain, he had been accepted. He watched the adults interact over those days. They groomed each other, running their jaws gently over each other's scales. They played, the younger adults chasing and wrestling while the alpha watched from its rock. And once, Dan saw one of the adults return to the blood trail where Runt had first been wounded. It paced the area slowly, sniffing the dried blood, and made a sound that rose and fell in a pattern Dan recognized immediately: grief. It sounded exactly like grief. These were not animals. They had language. They had family. They had sorrow. The Galactic Union had classified them as beasts, but the Union had never sat in the mud with them for 3 days. The Union had never been fed by them. The Union had never heard them mourned out on the 3rd evening. Dan heard engines in the distance. A shuttle, flying low over the canopy. Search pattern. They had finally come looking for him. He looked at Runt, who had managed to stand on shaking leg for the first time that afternoon. He looked at the alpha, who was already watching the sky with its one good eye, body tense. Dan stood up and put himself between the pack and the sound of the engines. The patrol shuttle landed hard in a gap between the trees, blowing mud and leaves across the clearing. 4 soldiers stepped out before the engines had fully stopped. 3 of them were Rithian, tall and gray-skinned with double-jointed arms. The 4th was their officer, a narrow-faced Rithian named Goss who carried his rank on a silver collar around his throat. They made it 6 steps into the clearing before they stopped. Goss saw the draiths first. His hand went to his sidearm. The 3 soldiers behind him raised their rifles in one smooth motion, training the barrels on the nearest adult, a big female with rust-colored scales who was resting near the tree line. Dan stepped into their line of fire. He looked terrible. 5 days in the jungle with no sleep, covered in alien blood, his clothes torn and stiff with mud. But he stood straight, and he put his hands out, palms forward, and he said one word: "Don't." Goss stared at him like he was looking at a dead man who did not know he was dead yet. Behind Dan, the pack had gone still. The alpha was on its feet, head low, scarred face pointed directly at the soldiers. Runt pressed against Dan's back, nearly knocking him off his feet. "Harlow," Goss said, reading the name off Dan's cargo tag. "You need to step away from those creatures immediately. We are authorized to use lethal force against Class 9 predators within range of the outpost." "They are not threatening the outpost," Dan said. "They have not threatened me. They have been feeding me. They are protecting their wounded juvenile. That is all they are doing." Goss looked at the massive animals surrounding the clearing. He looked at Dan, standing in the middle of them like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You are clearly suffering from psychological distress. Step away and we will extract you. I am not leaving until the juvenile can walk on its own. That is not your decision. It is exactly my decision." They stood like that for a long time. Goss with his hand on his weapon, Dan with mud on his face and a dragon at his back. The jungle buzzed around them, completely indifferent. Goss stepped back and spoke into his communicator. Dan heard pieces of the transmission. The words "deranged human" came through clearly. So did military extraction team and lethal removal authorized. Dan felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had expected this. The Union did not change its classifications because one human asked nicely. The draiths were listed as beasts. Beasts did not have rights. The patrol would come back with heavier weapons and orders to kill everything in the clearing that was not human. He looked at Runt. The juvenile was standing now, shaky but upright, its scales catching the last of the daylight. The wound on its flank was closing. The scar would be permanent, a rough line of raised tissue where the harpoon had been, but it was healing. It would live, if they let it. Dan looked at the alpha. The old creature was watching Goss and the soldiers with that one good eye. There was no panic in its expression. No dai, just a deep, tired awareness. It had seen this before. Soldiers. Weapons. Its kind being killed. It knew what was coming. That look decided everything for Dan. He turned to the shuttle wreckage and started working. He dragged panels across the clearing and stacked them in a rough barricade between the pack and the trail that led to the outpost. It would not stop a military team. It would barely slow them down. But it was a line, a visible, physical statement that said someone had chosen to stand here. Goss watched him build it. You understand what you are doing? Eat dough. You are obstructing a Union military operation. You will be arrested. Fine. They will kill the creatures regardless. Then they will have to step over me to do it. Goss shook his head slowly. He looked almost sorry. Then he led his team back to the shuttle and flew away to make his report. Dan sat down against the barricade and waited. The alpha came to him that night. It crossed the clearing slowly and lowered itself to the ground beside Dan, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from its scales. It was the first time the alpha had come this close voluntarily. Dan stayed still. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. The alpha rested its massive jaw on the ground near Dan's knee. It exhaled. The sound was deep and slow, almost like a sigh. Dan put his hand on the alpha's snout. The scales were warm and rough under his palm. The alpha did not flinch. It closed its good eye and leaned into the touch just slightly. Just enough. They sat like that in the dark while the jungle hummed around them. Dan thought about the morning. He thought about soldiers with heavy weapons marching into this clearing. He thought about Runt and the rust-colored female and the two younger adults who liked to wrestle near the stream that he thought about his years as a field medic. All the people he had pulled from the mud. All the ones he had lost. He had left the colonial wars because he could not stand one more body slipping away under his hands. He had become a cargo hauler because cargo did not scream and cargo did not die. And now here he was, in the mud again, holding on. The alpha rumbled softly beside him. Dan felt the vibration in his bones, and somehow, without understanding how, he knew what it meant. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was trust. Somewhere in the distance, engines were coming. 12 soldiers came out of the jungle at dawn. They moved in two lines, rifles up, armor plating reflecting the gray morning light. Heavy weapons. Pulse rifles rated to punch through vehicle armor. 2 of them carried net launchers loaded with electrified mesh. They were not here for a conversation. Dan was standing in front of his barricade when they arrived. He had not slept. His body ached in places he could not name. Behind him, the pack was awake. The alpha stood like a statue on the far side of the clearing, head high, watching. The 4 other adults had formed a loose semicircle around Runt and the nesting area. The squad leader was a Rithian colonel named Des. She was taller than Goss, and her gray skin had a darker tone that came from years of field duty. She stopped 10 meters from Dan and looked at him with an expression that was not angry. It was tired. She had done this kind of thing before. Dan Harlow, she said. Freelance cargo holder. Former colonial field medic. You have been in this clearing for 6 days. You are malnourished, sleep-deprived, and surrounded by creatures that could kill you in seconds. I am giving you one chance to step aside. No. Des looked past him at the draiths. Those are Class 9 predators. My orders are to neutralize the threat to the outpost. They're not a threat. They have been here for almost a week, and they have not gone near the outpost. They are a family protecting their wounded child. You can see that. What I can see is irrelevant. The classification is what matters. Then the classification is wrong. Des was quiet for a moment. Then she raised her hand, and the 12 soldiers tightened their formation. Fingers went to triggers. Safeties clicked off. The sound was small and precise and final. Dan did not move that he had no weapon. He had no authority. He had nothing except the fact that he was standing in the way. And standing in the way had always been enough, in his experience, to slow things down long enough for something to change. What happened next, Dan did not expect. Runt moved first. The juvenile limped forward from behind the line of adults, favoring its wounded flank. It crossed the clearing slowly, each step deliberate, and stopped directly behind Dan. Then it lowered its body and pressed its chest against his back. Dan staggered, but kept his feet. Runt's massive head curved around his shoulder, its jaw resting near his collarbone. One amber eye staring directly at the soldiers IT was shielding him. The alpha moved second. It crossed the clearing in 3 strides and took its place beside Dan, standing at his left shoulder, its scarred face turned toward the weapons. The rust-colored female came next, positioning herself on Dan's right. Then the 2 younger adults filled the gaps, .6 draiths and 1 human, standing a line across the clearing. Des stared. Her soldiers stared. Nobody fired. Dan's voice was shaking, but he kept it clear. Look at them. Look at what they're doing. They're not attacking you. They are protecting me. An animal does not do that. An animal does not choose to stand beside a stranger. They know what I did for their young, and they are telling you that I belong to them. If you cannot see intelligence in that, then I do not know what intelligence means to you. The standoff held. Minutes passed. The jungle was completely silent, as if every living thing on the moon was holding its breath. Des finally lowered her hand. Her soldiers shifted, confused. She touched her communicator and opened a channel not to her command, but to the Galactic Union General Frequency. This is Colonel Des, Union Military, Varith 6 Outpost. I am reporting a situation that requires council review. A human civilian has made sustained contact with a draith pack. The creatures are displaying behavior inconsistent with their Class 9 classification, requesting hold on all lethal orders pending review. The response came not from Union Command, but from a voice Dan did not recognize. It was soft and ancient and spoke with the slow precision of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say what they were about to say. This is Ambassador Lura of the Palori delegation. We have been monitoring the situation. We formally request an emergency session of a Union Council. The draiths of Varith 6 are not animals. They have never been animals. We have 400 years of research that your Union chose to ignore. This human has accomplished in 6 days what politics has prevented for centuries. We will not allow this to be erased with pulse rifles. The channel went silent. Des looked at Dan. Dan looked at her. Stand down, Des said to her soldiers. We are holding position until the council rules. The soldiers lowered their weapons. Dan felt his knees go soft, and he nearly fell. Runt's body pressed harder against his back, holding him up. The alpha rumbled, a low sound that vibrated through the earth, and Dan felt the answer roll back from the other adults. The whole pack speaking at once, a wave of subsonic sound that passed through his body like a heartbeat. He did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning that we are still here. We are all still here. Dan put his hand on Runt's jaw and closed his eyes. His legs were trembling. His hands were shaking, but he was smiling. For the first time in 6 days, he was smiling. The line had held. The council chamber on Station Halcyon was built to hold 300 delegates from across the Galactic Union. On most days, half the seats were empty. Today, every seat was full and there were aliens standing along the walls. Dan Harlow sat in the witness chair at the center of the floor. He had been given clean clothes and a shower for the first time in a week. Someone had treated the cuts on his hands and the bruise along his ribs where Runt had pressed too hard against him. He looked like a man who had been through something. He looked exactly like what he was. Ambassador Lura of the Palori stood at the speaker's platform. She was ancient even by Palori standards, her translucent skin showing the slow pulse of blue light beneath. The Palori were a quiet species. They observed. They studied. They rarely spoke in council sessions. Most delegates had forgotten they were even members. Today, they spoke. Lura presented 400 years of research. Her people had been studying draiths since before the Union classified them. They had recorded over 800 distinct vocalizations organized into patterns that matched every known definition of language. They had documented pack governance, decision-making rituals, territorial negotiations between neighboring groups, and conflict resolution that did not always end in violence. They had observed tool usage. Juveniles used sticks and rocks to dig for burrowing prey. Adults carried smooth stones in their jaw pouches and used them to crack open the shells of river creatures. And they had documented mourning. When a pack member died, the others would return to the place of death for days, sometimes weeks. They would vocalize in patterns that changed over time, growing softer, slower, quieter. The Palori had a word for what the draiths were doing. The closest translation in human language was singing them home. The chamber was silent when Lura finished. Then the arguments began. The Rithian delegates spoke first. The Rithians had hunted draiths for sport for over 2 centuries. Their military used draith hides for ceremonial armor. Their pharmaceutical industry harvested venom glands for high-value compounds. Reclassifying the draiths as sapient would make all of that illegal retroactively. Billions in trade, gone overnight. This is one human's experience with one pack, the Rithian delegate said. Anecdotal, uncontrolled, a traumatized man anthropomorphizing dangerous wildlife. The Palori research, while extensive, has never been peer-reviewed by Union Standard methodology. We cannot reclassify an entire species based on emotion. 3 other delegations supported the Rithian position. The economic arguments were strong. Entire supply chains would collapse. Jobs would be lost. Military operations across 6 systems would need to be restructured. Dan listened to all of it from the witness chair. He had been told he would be allowed to speak, but nobody had told him when. He waited. The Felani delegate, a tall insectoid with compound eyes that reflected the chamber lights, asked a question that silenced the room. If the draiths are sapient, then what we have been doing to them has a different name. The Rithian delegate is correct that the economic impact would be significant. But the economic impact of acknowledging wrongdoing is always significant. That does not make the wrongdoing less real. The chamber stirred. More delegates spoke. The debate went back and forth for 3 hours. Dan sat in his chair and waited. When they finally called his name, he stood up slowly. His legs were stiff. His hands were still bandaged. He walked to the speaker's platform and looked out at 300 faces from dozens of species, all of them watching him. He did not give a speech that he described what he saw. The way the alpha sniffed his hands after he treated Runt's wounds. The way the pack brought him food, closer each day, waiting for him to accept it before they ate. The way one adult returned to the blood trail and paced and vocalized in a pattern that rose and fell like breathing. The way Runt pressed against his back when the soldiers came, choosing to put its body between Dan and danger. He described the whimper. The sound the juvenile made when Dan first found it in the clearing, dying in the mud with a harpoon in its side. He said it was low and broken, and it came up through the ground and settled in his chest. I have heard that sound before, Dan said. On battlefields, from soldiers who were dying. They all make the same sound. Every species, every language. It is the sound of someone who is afraid and in pain and does not want to be alone. I heard it from that creature, and I could not walk away. I am asking you not to walk away either. He stepped back from the platform and returned to his chair. The vote was called 1 hour later. 14 delegations voted to reclassify the draith species as provisionally sapient. 7 voted against. The motion carried. Poaching became a capital offense effective immediately. Draith territories across all known systems were designated as sovereign zones. The Rithian delegation lodged a formal protest and walked out. Nobody stopped them. After the session, a Union official approached Dan with a medal in a velvet case. A commendation for extraordinary interspecies contact. Dan looked at it for a long moment. I do not want that, he said. I want to shuttle back to Varith 6. The official blinked. You want to go back? They are waiting for me. He landed on the jungle moon 2 days later. The clearing was different now. The barricade had been taken apart. His old shelter was still standing, battered by weather but intact. The fire pit was cold. The jungle was quiet. Dan stepped off the shuttle ramp and stood in the mud and waited. Runt came out of the trees first. Bigger now, stronger. The scar on its flank had faded to a pale line against dark green scales. It crossed the clearing at a run and hit Dan so hard he went down in the mud, flat on his back, with a dragon the size of a truck standing over him, making that deep rumbling sound that vibrated through everything. Dan laughed. He put both hands on Runt's face and laughed until his eyes burned. From the tree-line, the Alpha watched. It rumbled once, low and steady. Welcome back. 2 years changed everything and nothing at the same time. Dan built his outpost at the edge of the Pack's territory using salvage from old supply drops and materials the Union sent once they realized he was not leaving. It was a small building, one room with a cot, a workbench, a sensor grid, and a window that faced east so he could watch the sun come up over the valley. It was not much. It was enough. Runt slept outside every night. The juvenile was fully grown now, the largest member of the pack after the alpha, with scales so dark they looked black in certain light. The scar on its flank had turned silver. It never fully faded. Dan sometimes put his hand on it when Runt was sleeping and felt the rough ridge of healed tissue under his palm and remembered the night he pulled the harpoon free. Researchers came from across the Union. Palori linguists studying draith vocalizations. Felony biologists mapping the pack's social structure. Human anthropologists who wanted to understand how Dan had been accepted. Dan let them observe from a distance. Nobody got closer to the pack than he allowed. The draiths tolerated the visitors because Dan was calm around them, and the pack had learned to read Dan's moods with unsettling accuracy. If Dan was relaxed, the visitors were safe. If Dan was tense, the alpha would appear at the tree line, and the visitors would suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. The ripple effect of the reclassification spread wider than Dan had imagined. Other Deathworlders, humans and Gorvathi and felony scouts, began reporting similar bonds with species the Union had classified as dangerous. A human marine biologist on the ocean world of Pellis, 3 had been living with a pod of deep-sea predators for months, documenting language and tool use. A Gorvathi ranger on a volcanic moon had formed an alliance with a colony of 6-legged creatures that built complex underground cities. One by one, the reports came in. The word beast was formally removed from Galactic Union biological language and replaced with unstudied sapient candidate. It was a small change in wording. It meant everything. Dan followed the news on a small terminal in the evenings while Runt breathed slow and heavy outside his window. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had done one obvious thing and was still surprised that the obvious thing had not been done before. The poachers came on a night with no moon. Dan's sensor grid picked them up first. 3 heat signatures moving through the jungle from the north, following the river toward the pack's nesting ground. They were carrying equipment, heavy cases that showed up as cold rectangles on the thermal scan, tranquilizer rigs, containment frames, professional gear. Dan sent an alert to the Union patrol station. The response came back in seconds. Help was 4 hours out. 4 hours was too long. He grabbed his field kit and his emergency beacon and ran into the jungle. Runt woke the moment Dan left the outpost and followed, crashing through the undergrowth behind him with a sound like a landslide. They reached the nesting ground 20 minutes later. Dan could hear the poachers ahead, moving through the brush with practiced quiet. He could also hear the pack. The adults were awake, rumbling to each other in low frequencies, aware that something was wrong, but not yet sure what. The first tranquilizer dart hit a juvenile before Dan could shout a warning. The small creature, barely a year old, stumbled and collapsed near the stream. 2 poachers emerged from the brush with a containment rig, moving fast. The alpha hit them like a wall. It came from the left, silent for something so massive, and struck the lead poacher with its shoulder. The man flew backward and crashed into a tree. The second poacher fired another dart, but it bounced off the alpha's scarred face plating. The alpha roared, and the sound was so loud it shook leaves from the canopy. The pack fought as a unit. The rust-colored female blocked the path back to the river. The 2 younger adults flanked the remaining poacher and drove him toward the clearing. Dan reached the drugged juvenile and pulled it away from the containment rig, dragging the small creature to safety behind a fallen log. 1 poacher broke free. He came through the brush fast, a plasma cutter in his hand, and he saw Dan crouching beside the juvenile. He raised the weapon. Runt came through the trees. The impact shook the ground. Runt put its entire body between Dan and the poacher, scales flared wide, jaw open, a sound coming from its throat that Dan had never heard before. It was not a roar. It was fury, pure and focused and older than language. The poacher fired. The plasma bolt hit Runt's shoulder armor and deflected into the canopy, setting a branch on fire. Runt did not flinch. It lunged forward and pinned the poacher to the ground with one massive claw, pressing just hard enough to hold him without crushing him. Then it looked at Dan waiting. Dan shook his head. No. Runt held the poacher for one more second. Then it lifted its claw and stepped back. The man gasped and did not move. Union forces arrived 4 hours later and found 3 poachers bound with cargo straps and guarded by a pack of draiths who watched the soldiers with calm, intelligent eyes. Dan was sitting against a tree with the drugged juvenile in his lap, stroking its head and waiting for the sedative to wear off. The footage from Dan's emergency beacon was broadcast across the galaxy. The image of Runt shielding Dan, mirroring the moment 2 years earlier when Dan had shielded Runt, became the most viewed recording in Union history that a nature documentary aired a year later. It closed with footage of the valley on Varith 6, the pack's juveniles playing in the river, the rust-colored female basking on a warm rock, the alpha watching from a high ridge, scarred and ancient in content, and Dan sitting on the hillside above the valley with Runt beside him. Runt's massive head resting near Dan's lap. Dan scratching the ridge above Runt's eye. Runt rumbling, a sound so deep it traveled through the ground. The narrator spoke over the image. In the vastness of the galaxy, intelligence has taken countless forms. We have found it in mathematics, in architecture, in song. But the humans taught us to find it in something simpler. A creature in pain, a hand that reaches out, a choice to stay. The draiths of Varith 6 were not discovered by science. They were discovered by stubbornness, compassion, and a man who simply refused to walk away. The camera held on Dan and Runt as the sun went down. Runt rumbled once more, and from across the valley, one by one, the whole pack answered. The sound carried over the jungle and up into the sky where the stars were just beginning to show that IT sounded like home.